Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Distinguished Lecture on Ethics and Leadership. It's great to see you all here in person, and I'd also like to extend a welcome to you all who are joining us by live stream. My name's Dan Inkster, and I am the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership. I'd like to open today's event by saying a few words about Elizabeth Rockwell, who endowed this lecture, and also the Ethics and Leadership Center that I direct. You probably know her name. We are in a venue named after her, the Rockwell Pavilion. You may have also seen her name on the Rockwell Career Center at the Bauer College of Business. Her name is also attached to the titles of several deans, the Dean of Education, Dean of Libraries, and Dean of Engineering. So you've probably, if you're associated with the University of Houston, you've probably run into Elizabeth Rockwell's name before, but who was she? She grew up hearing the harrowing tale of how her two grandparents barely survived the Great Galveston Storm of 1900. I've actually read this account. Her grandparents, the water was rising, so they climbed onto the stove. The water kept rising. It came up to their necks. They held their heads up. The house started moving, and they came out the next day. They survived it, but the house was 100 feet from where it had started out. But a really terrifying tale. She was born and raised in Houston and entered the University of Houston to study business in 1938. Eventually, she made her way into estate planning and was one of the first people to figure out how to use IRAs, individual retirement accounts. She used this knowledge of IRAs, this was back in the 70s, in her words, to put needed dollars in the pockets of retiring individuals. One of her friends described her this way: she was a hard-charging woman in the biz before there were hard-charging women in the biz. So she was a real pioneer. One of Elizabeth Rockwell's last gifts to the University of Houston was to endow the creation of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership, a central pillar of which is an annual lecture on ethics and leadership. So we gather here today to honor Elizabeth D. Rockwell, who gave so much to the University of Houston. And I can't imagine a more fitting speaker to honor her memory with than the one we have with us today, Carolyn Randall Williams. It's really hard to know where to begin introducing Carolyn Randall Williams. She's done so much, had an effect on so many people in so many different areas. Her first book was a rollicking, fantastic tale about Bebe Bright, possible princess, who finds herself exiled to Bee Island with her three godmommies, her tutor, Mamselle, who, for some reason I will have to ask you about later, has brought a miniature horse with her to the island as one of her necessary items. Completely unexplained in the book, but it definitely caught my attention. And on the island also, there are 8 mysterious princesses whom Bebe has to meet before she can step off the island. I read this book with my 10-year-old daughter. It's a fantastic book. It's back there for sale, so you might want to check it out on your way out. Her second book is part family memoir, part cookbook, Soul Food Love, that tells family kitchen stories across 3 centuries of her family's history and offers delicious recipes from her great-grandmother's grandmother and mother, but made, as she says, greener, healthier, and easier. Her next book was Lucy Negro Redux, a hybrid book of poems, vignettes, and essays that takes inspiration from Shakespeare's Dark Lady sonnets to explore questions about desire for the female body. In 2019, the Nashville Ballet performed an adaptation of Lucy Negro Redux that the New York Times called, quote, something wildly original, something so unlike anything else that all description falls short of its otherworldly reality. And then there are Ms. Williams' op-ed pieces. In 2017, she published a much-discussed op-ed, President Obama, where are you? And then in 2020, you want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument. The latter coming a month after George Floyd's murder and at the height of debates about Confederate monuments offered a powerful personal historical challenge to romanticize versions of the Old South, as well as raising profound questions about who should be telling the stories about the Confederacy and how they should be told. Today, Ms. Williams will talk about The Body is the Text, One Woman's American Narrative. She'll talk for, actually, we didn't talk about this, 30, 40 minutes? 30, 40 minutes? Yeah, okay, perfect. And we'll then take questions until about 5:20 p.m. If you're here in the audience, we have microphones, and so raise your hand, and someone will come around with a microphone so that the people on the live stream can hear your questions. If you're on the live stream and you have a question, join the chat, and then you can type in a question, and Professor Johanna Luttrell here, who is the Assistant Director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center, will read out these questions. So with that, let me present you a very extraordinary person, Caroline Randall Williams.
I haven't had BB Bright celebrated so generously in a long time. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to start this afternoon by reading a poem I've not read aloud in a long time. It's one of the very few poems from my undergraduate thesis collection that made it into my first published collection, Lucy Negro Redux. I'll read it to you under its original title, and then we'll go on from there. Nude Study. Once, in the night, with maybe one lamp going, my shirt was finally raised over my head, my brassiere unclasped, tights rolled down and underwear offed, hip, knee, ankle. Then, what would you think of my body? Had you ever negotiated such coarse hair, seen nipples dark and darker in their tensing, breasts swaying sideways with the weight of them? Did you know how much it was to ask to be the first glimpse of a naked black body? Did you know the fear of being found fearful? And later, after you'd grown accustomed, proved yourself equal to my landscape, you laughed and said, "Let's play masters and slaves." I wore it lightly, said no, moved on. But it made me think about my teeth on the couch, glowing white there in the light of the television, against my skin. Made me grateful for my perfume covering the smell of my body. Made me wonder when it would be time again to get a relaxer before my hair betrayed my best efforts to straighten it. Made me alive to all the offenses nature is prone to. When you said, "Let's play masters and slaves," you thought role play. I thought black girl. My early poems that found my way into my book, I call them my sublimating Lucy poems. Lucy, or Black Luce, or Lucy Negro, was a real historical figure from Elizabethan England who was a controversial but acknowledged and, in my mind, best candidate for the true identity of the Dark Lady who became the subject of Shakespeare's last 37 sonnets. I've loved Shakespeare all my life, so when I found out he might have had a black girlfriend, I decided it must be true, and I wrote a book about it. And I put the poem Nude Study in that book to remind myself how much I needed Lucy, even just the idea of her, before I ever knew she existed. I claimed representation in the canon with Lucy, and it went some way toward healing my experiences like the one I fought to describe in that poem. In my book, the poem is called Shortly Before Meeting Lucy, a White Boy. Did you know the fear of being found fearful? When I wrote that question, my stance was defensive, self-protective. I felt a need to explain my insecurities and any subsequent behavior or character irregularities that might have resulted or needed explaining from them in any direction, from any audience. Now when I read that poem, however, it's an invitation to you all to engage in an act of empathy. Do you know the fear of being found fearful? Or it is an offering of respite and solidarity for those among you who have felt that fear and never heard it said aloud. My saying, you do know the fear of being found fearful, and I see you, I've felt it too. So what's all this got to do with ethics, with leadership? Well, to me, it's got something to do with belongingness, with what I believe is a good leader's moral, ethical, and practical obligation to lead in a way that allow those who choose or who are obliged to follow you to feel included. So I'd now like to share with you a running list of words I've been obsessing over lately, in no particular order beyond my poet's ear that insists I read them with a cadence, a rhythm that serves my aesthetic purpose. Collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land. Do you know the fear of being found fearful? It's a question I asked long before I had the language for this concept of consensual reality, one of my obsessions on the list. It's a notion I'd like to explore with you all here and now. It's not my phrase. I first came across it in Anne Fadiman's brilliant book, The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down, where she quotes a terrific insight from another brilliant woman, California-based psychologist, Suki Waller. But like other words and concepts to come in this talk, I'm something obsessed with this notion of consensual reality. To me, it's the most productive and tangible outcome of a collective empathy exercise. Like, say, this democratic experiment we're all trying to keep afloat. To me, consensual reality is not simply about acknowledging that the truth can look different from different perspectives, but to understand that our methods of analyzing and receiving the truth impact the nature of what we glean from it. Working toward consensual reality invites us to push past bias into harder questions about how we re-examine our position. It's about how we invite ourselves not just to acknowledge our own blind spots. Do you know the fear of being found fearful? But to consider more carefully the ways in which others might see the world. It's Dr. Du Bois's double consciousness put to good, empathetic use. It's about building mechanisms that allow us to hold space for another person's sense of the truth to make sense to us, and then to build bridges back to each other and to ourselves. We achieve consensual reality by working toward understanding the nature of the other person's truth, and then finding a place to fundamentally connect. That is the essential point from which productive relationships can move forward, from which effective leaders guide those they lead. Ultimately, we establish consensual reality by activating our empathy. We can make choices that create trust and really do serve the collective community, even one as complicated, strange, wild, and promising as the United States body politic to which we belong, of which we are so many dynamic parts. To that point, many dynamic parts, I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you another poem. One that is still new to me and waiting to make its official debut on the page. It's out with a couple of places to be published. In one of my other lives, my many lives with many hats, I taught high school English at a predominantly white all-boys school in Nashville, Tennessee. During that year, I spent a great deal of time working toward achieving so many different kinds of consensual reality with boys. This poem is called Sestina for the Boys on the Hill. Every afternoon, the boys storm the room, ravenous, claim a window each to each, press the glass open, and spit. At first, I tried to stop them, these young guns. I could not trust or believe in their joy. How could spitting alone shrug the world's weight? defeat by degrees. Wait for it, Miss Williams, you'll see. And the boys leaned their heads out, spit. And because my joy came so much from them, I loved the window for its clean fun, not girls or games or guns, just young men and gravity and spit. Thinking more, though, on white spit. I feel history tremble through me, her weight asking, "Where's it been aimed, girl? At whom? With guns?" And her hand, her mouth, my mouth. "Boys," I say, "sit down." I reach, shut the window, and we divide my joy from their joy. My past sense, she fractures joy. She fears young white men in the South who spit for fun. She knows a brick through a window was good sport once too, wonders, would the weight of your spit have been aimed at girls and boys walking black to school, facing dogs and guns? I've never loaded a gun or opened a window to spit for joy. I have been an object to men and to boys, a brown body made for whistles and spit. That's the thought behind the gaze, as my weight swings my hips, makes me a frame, a window. History, viewed through my window, reframes herself, asks hard questions of guns wielded for sport, for the weight of felled game. When men bear arms to find joy, it costs us things. Still, careless, like spitting, they pull back, let loose, please their inner boy. At my room's window, I saw death stalk joy, imagining guns my kids polish with spit. But hope says, wait. Make good men from these boys. I hope that I was an ethical leader in that classroom. Being a black body every day in that space was hard. Being a Democrat every day in that space was hard. Being a woman every day in that space was hard. Wanting all the best for them, putting my energy toward expanding their minds, that was natural and right and nourishing. My wish for them was one of ensuring they felt seen, heard, and cared for and educated by me. I had to build a strong bridge between my sense of what was real and theirs to make that work. And it was challenging and fraught and rewarding, and much of that labor is at the heart of the work I still do today. I have the peculiar luxury of representing otherness in multiple ways. As you heard in the poem, I taught in all-boys school. I have been a woman in patriarchal space. I have been Southern in Northern spaces. I am always Black in American spaces. So I've already said that I believe belongingness, inclusivity, is a kind of ethical obligation. And my perpetual otherness, I would argue, makes me unusually well equipped to judge just how inclusive, how ethical, how equitable a place or a person or an institution is relative to however deeply it intends to honor those virtues. I'm a barometer because in so many ways I don't obviously belong in hardly any spaces. That is to say, more often than not, a reasonable way to tell if a gathering or person or institution is inclusive, manifests belonging ethically, is to answer the question, does it include me? Does my body belong in your space with all its stories? If you let me in but don't help me feel welcome, a kind of inclusion, diversity box has been ticked, but the brief has not been met. I think that's because we all know by now that if we're not fighting for it, we're not pulling it off. Because, let me tell you, I'm fighting for it all the time. Every day, I'm fighting to feel like I belong, and to include and help people belong coming up behind me. It cannot be that the historically othered must be solely responsible for their sense of welcome at the table, whatever that table may be. Collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land. You've heard these obsessions of mine, and I'm going to offer you yet one more, etymology. Don't worry, I'll circle back to the other ones eventually. But first, this newly named love of how words work. Isn't it wild the way the word share, for example, in its verb form means both to divide and to tell, to give away something to someone else, or to say your piece? There are so many ways to share the truth. Here's another one of mine, a body story that demands to be told because its layers will serve us later in this talk. I was born on August 24th, 1987. 32 years before I was born, to the day, Emmett Till walked into Bryant's grocery store on Money Road in Greenwood, Mississippi, and had an exchange that would ultimately end his life. 32 years to the day, and I still can't get over that somehow. And the words I've got to say next, you know them: collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land. And the way the land holds hard stories like DNA does. What was the world remembering? What were Black mothers remembering? What sighs was the South heaving in memorial and grief on the day that I landed here? 32 years to the day. I'm also clearly something obsessed with how we remember. And I think that's got to be a part of it. Here, let me share it another way. I'm trying to be a credible messenger. I lived at 514 Grand Boulevard in Greenwood, Mississippi for 2 years, straight out of college. If I took a right out of my driveway and carried on down the boulevard till it crossed a little bridge over the Tallahatchie River, it turned into one of those classic Delta highways that always seemed to me to be some bright-lit, vacant intersection of life and death all the time. Keep driving, and you pass the Tallahatchie Flats, a social space with decorative shacks and curated antique plows, grim reminders of how cheerfully erasure is undertaken in the name of Southern hospitality. But that's not the story I'm here to tell this afternoon. The story I'm here to share today is about the first time I kept driving down that highway till it became Money Road. I was 22, I was full of fear and wonder at my new home, and still had something of the voyeur adventurer about me. Cotton field, how wild. Endless corn, how wild. Beans, more cotton, wild again. Look at this place. And then I got to a stretch of road by the tracks that looked, well, it looked like something out of a deep South, don't know better whimsy. I was thinking of the Kathy Bates parts of Fried Green Tomatoes, a stretch of road that used to be a place where lives were lived. I've always been called to what's haunted, but this wasn't a familiar strain. I parked and got out of the car. I'd seen some ancient thing, some vine-covered relic that touched the romantic parts of my mind. I got out to look, thinking of Itchy and Ruth and other silly white revisionist shit that years of living in the Delta would free me from. I got out and I walked closer and I saw the remains of Bryant's grocery store. Now you must remember, I was standing on the far end of the street Grand Boulevard became once it crossed the river. I was standing on the same street where I paid white people to live. I took a couple of steps back and threw up where I stood. Then I got in my car and never drove back there. A couple of months later, I spent August 24th, 2010, waking and sleeping on the same street where Emmett Till spent his last day as an unmarked boy, on the same street where he whistled and became a marked man. I still don't know what words are enough to honor him and his legacy, honor Mamie Till and her broken heart, honor simply a boy who ought to have lived. We all know Mamie left his coffin open, and we ought to know why. It's because she knew that bodies tell stories. She knew a grave and tremendous American narrative was written on her child's flesh, and she made sure the record was writ large and cataloged. She did her job so well that I had his text seared in my mind. It's why I heaved on that street. I read the story the way she intended it, and it effing moved me. In the South, we know that bodies tell stories, and we know that places have memories. We know that the land is a soulful thing. Every day I taught in the Delta, despite never going back to Bryant's Grocery, I was still faced daily with Emmett Till. Every day I drove to teach school from 2010 to 2012, I drove down Emmett Till Memorial Highway. Or that's what the simple green sign said. There's no context, no explanation about how that was the stretch of road he'd been dragged behind before finally being cast off of the truck. No acknowledgement of the crazy-making, terrible, bloody legacy of how that stretch of pavement got its name. But at least there was a sign. In Money, Mississippi, there was nothing. I think that's another part of why I was so ill. No warning, no dignifying of the ground, no moment of claiming the shame. It was the slinking, cowardly shame of anyone who runs and lies about what they've done. Not the owning, productive shame that drags itself into the light and seeks to begin anew. No kind of monument, unless the absence is one, for those of us with the perspective to see. Here I return to etymology again. One source word, working definition of our word monument comes, and forgive my pronunciation, my Latin is entirely an amateur pursuit, from monere, which means to remind, to advise, or to warn. I think we forget about those two parts, those last two, or they've fallen away from our familiar sense of the word monument as it's used today. I live my life in what I like to call a body politic, with a K. The term came about almost as a joke. It came to me tongue in cheek, as a nudge, but also a mental paper cut, an unreachable itch. I'm obviously interested, albeit distantly, in the sort of medieval definition of a body politic as the people of a nation, state, or society considered collectively as an organized group of citizens, because of the ways in which my body, my genetic makeup, and my appearance complicate the story of how that is supposed to be understood in America. But I'm more interested in the notion of how my body's story makes me reconsider and reframe the notion of realpolitik, with a K, the system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. The fact of the matter is that the practical principles of my life are based on what I consider to be the failures of the moral and ideological considerations of the people and ruling structures of this country. When I wrote that my body was a Confederate monument, I was getting to that point. When I wrote that to chastise my country was to show love for it, I was getting to that point. Living in a body as a monument, as part of the American body politic with a C, continually forces me to consider questions through the lens of realpolitik. It's a mutant child of Du Bois's double consciousness, in a way. It's not to see myself twice, but to see the world for what it is rather than what it says it is, in order to actually survive it. Let me put it another way. One of the worst fights my mother and I ever had was when I was learning to drive. And we managed to write 2 books together. I should just put an aside there. When I was learning to drive, there's a hilly street near my house. Near the top of one of those hills, there's a T intersection with a stop sign for people merging onto the hilly street in question. Driving home one day with my mom in the car, she began telling me to slow down as we approached the intersection. I kept my foot on the gas and blew past it like I'd always done, calmly telling her that I had the right of way, that the other drivers had a stop sign. She had zero interest in this position. She taught me a lesson then that has been profoundly useful to me in the context well beyond the specific concerns of this conversation. Assuming that people will follow the rules, do the right thing like it says on paper when nobody's watching, can and will get you killed if you don't make necessary preparations and take necessary precautions. Why would I just assume that the person at that stop sign would stop and wait and see me? I might have been right about my right of way, but I could have been right and still dead, as she put it. Expecting America to do what it says about life and liberty and pursuing happiness and justice for all and all that, well, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's the kind of assumption that can and will get you dead or broken in this country if you're just about any kind of other and you don't operate with and apply some kind of perspective. I'm writing and thinking and speaking louder and more regularly than I ever have in my life about this stuff because I think people need to see how this looks in real time. I've lived so much in white spaces in this black body, and I think it's time to talk more about what I've learned from figuring out how to survive it, to the degree that I have. Not just about myself, but about certain kinds of American blind spots, and ultimately how we might better give and receive necessary, tough love. I'm writing and speaking now because after the events at the end of last May, the first week of last June, I had to do something. I couldn't march because I have asthma, and I was afraid for my own ability to breathe. But I couldn't spend another day wondering, is my whole life going to be defined and framed by old American limitations? In other words, like I said, spent my whole life trying to figure out how we survive this. Now here I would like to share with you one of my favorite poems that's not my own, because it speaks to the ways in which a body really can be an essential monument to the self and a testimony of survival. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Lucille Clifton. Lucille Clifton made her life a monument. In the poem, she invites us to see her as a starshine and clay molded sculpture of secularly sacred art, a kind of life. Now, in the spirit of celebrating those who came before by emulating them, I'm going to take a moment to put my own poet's hat back on and invite you all to be among the first to hear the beginning of a longer form prose poem inspired by this conversation. When I wrote that my body was a monument, that was only the beginning of the thought. The body does so much work past the work, so much telling past the shape of the thing. My body has been a bent note, a sound made for the blues. My body has been a sharp knife made for fear and polish and blood and good steak. She is also a whole book, an artifact, a mirror, an instrument, a weapon, a frame, a window, a pipe, a funnel, an altar, a vehicle, a platonic ideal, and a veil, and a cave, and a capo, and all 6 strings of the guitar together. What if I told you that every body is a living document, a text to be read by the world, a text you write on, revise, reread, redress, a text that the world reads and misreads, handles and mishandles. Yeah, the body. She's a monument, she's a document. She's a declaration of freedom or peace or war. What else? It's easy to imagine the body a weapon. But what kind of weapon am I? Is a bridge a finished weapon or a tool, an asset? Am I a bridge? I've been one before, but am I still? Do you stay all the things you've been once you've been them? Collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land. Well, I say we can hold these many truths together at once. I remember the first, and I should say the only time I got pulled over for speeding since the Black Lives Matter movement took hold. Breonna Taylor was still alive, but Sandra Bland had long since lost her life on the other side of a simple traffic stop. I was scared. I followed rules I'd begun to realize I'd have to teach any children that would one day come out of my body. Rules about narrating your actions and keeping your hands up and still, rules that had, in my life of great privilege and little driving, felt sometimes far from my life until that moment. I was scared. And I saw the police officer see that I was scared. And then, more complicatedly, I saw him become unsettled, surprised, and even a little upset that I was scared. And not because he was an obviously good or obviously bad guy. I don't know anything about that part. But because I didn't look to him like someone he would expect to be scared of the police. I didn't look to him like someone who maybe even ought to find him fearful in his opinion. He was confused by the way his power was manifesting. He was confused by the way he presented and how it landed with me. I don't think he'd ever been looked at with the kind of fear I had for him from the kind of person who had it for him. And in that moment, I watched him learn it, the fear of being found fearful. He learned it then, and I hope he put it to good use. Now is a moment when naming things, even when, like that for me, because I haven't clarified my feelings about it, when they're too hard, or too obvious, or too fraught. It's necessary. We have to name the things as we process them. When I said I didn't look to him like somebody who ought to fear him, what I mean is I was wearing pearls that day. I was driving a certain quality of car. My hair was straightened, which I almost never do anymore because it makes people ask me, which one of your parents was white? And the answer is neither of them. I think my ambiguity made me look safe to him. My understanding of my own identity made him look dangerous to me. We can hold two truths together at once. Stay with me. We're getting somewhere. I know it's complicated. I'm going to share with you now another poem. It's called Field Nigger. It's also from my undergraduate thesis. And so it's got another title, too, from when I got to expand my sense of belonging in my own skin, called Sublimating Lucy. Tired of answering certain questions. This scarf, I bought it at some airport, going somewhere. Could it have been Dublin? Nope, I got there by boat. And this belt and this bag, well, isn't it wonderful to have a drawer to put each of these things away in? Just trying to be wife material, I've become quite the genealogist. It makes me able to explain how I am not half black. I haven't been half black since the one-drop rule, since at least 4 of my great-great-grandfathers raped 4 of my great-great-grandmothers, and those women had children, and those men didn't. Memory is a poor servant, just a field nigger like me, plowing to put something on the page. Now, that poem is the predecessor to the article I wrote last year in the New York Times, a piece that in many ways is part of why I have the honor of being with you all here today, and which unpacks the poem better than I've ever been able to, before or since. In light of that, I'd like to share a bit of that piece with you now. I have rape-colored skin. My light brown blackness is a living testament to the rules, the practices, the causes of the Old South. If there are those who want to remember the legacy of the Confederacy, if they want monuments, well, my body is a monument. My skin is a monument. According to dead Confederates are honored all over this country, with cartoonish private statues, solemn public monuments, and even in the names of United States Army bases. It fortifies and heartens me to witness the protests against this practice and the growing clamor from serious, nonpartisan public servants to redress it, but there's a difference between rewriting and reframing the past. I say it is not a matter of airbrushing history, but of adding a new perspective. I am a Black Southern woman, and of my immediate white male ancestors, all of them were rapists. My very existence is a relic of slavery and Jim Crow. According to the rule of hypodescent, the social and legal practice of assigning a genetically mixed race person to the race with less social power, I am the daughter of 2 Black people, the granddaughter of 4 Black people, the great-granddaughter of 8 Black people. Go back one more generation, and it gets less straightforward and more sinister. As far as family history has always told, and as modern DNA has allowed me to confirm, I am the descendant of Black women who were domestic servants and white men who raped their help. It is an extraordinary truth of my life that I am biologically more than half white, and yet I have no white people in my genealogy in living memory. No voluntary whiteness. I am more than half white, and none of it was consensual. White Southern men, my ancestors, took what they wanted from women they did not love, over whom they had extraordinary power, and then failed to claim their children. What is a monument but a standing memory? An artifact to make tangible the truth of the past. My body and blood are a tangible truth of the South and its past. The Black people I come from were owned by the white people I come from. The white people I come from fought and died for their lost cause. And I ask you now, who dares to tell me to celebrate them? Who dares to ask me to accept their mounted pedestals? You cannot dismiss me as someone who doesn't understand. You cannot say it wasn't my family members who fought and died. My Blackness does not put me on the other side of anything. It puts me squarely at the heart of the debate. I don't just come from the South. I come from Confederates. I've got rebel gray blue blood coursing my veins. My great-grandfather Will was raised with the knowledge that Edmund Pettus was his father. Pettus, the storied Confederate general, the grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, the man for whom Selma's Bloody Sunday Bridge is named. So I'm not an outsider who makes these demands. I'm a great-great-granddaughter. And here I am called to say that there's much about the South that is precious to me. I do my best teaching and writing here. There is, however, a peculiar model of Southern pride that must now, at long last, be reckoned with. This is not an ignorant pride, but a defiant one. It is a pride that says, our history is rich, our causes are justified, our ancestors lie beyond reproach. It is a pining for greatness, if you will, a wish again for a certain kind of American memory, a monument-worthy memory. But here's the thing. Our ancestors don't deserve your unconditional pride. Yes, I am proud of every one of my Black ancestors who survived slavery. They earned that pride by any decent person's reckoning. But I am not proud of the white ancestors whom I know, by virtue of my very existence, to be bad actors. Among the apologists for the Southern cause and for its monuments, there are those who dismiss the hardships of the past. They imagine a world of benevolent masters and speak with misty eyes of gentility and honor and the land. They deny plantation rape or explain it away or question the degree of frequency with which it occurred. To those people, it is my privilege to say, I am proof. I am proof that whatever else the South might have been or might believe itself to be, it was and is a space whose prosperity and sense of romance and nostalgia were built upon the grievous exploitation of Black life. The dream version of the Old South never existed. Any manufactured monument to that time in that place tells half a truth at best. The ideas and ideals it purports to honor are not real. To those who have embraced these delusions, now is the time to re-examine your position. Either you have been blind to a truth that my body's story forces you to see, or you really do mean to honor the oppressors at the expense of the oppressed. And you must at last acknowledge your emotional investment in a legacy of hate. Either way, I say the monuments of stone and metal, the monuments of cloth and wood, all the man-made monuments must come down. I defy any sentimental Southerner to defend our ancestors to me. I'm quite literally made of reasons to strip them of their laurels. It's another privilege of my life that I get to be a part of these conversations in this moment in history, with all of its lows and some of its seismic highs, too. This past June, we celebrated the first ever federally sanctioned Juneteenth, a holiday that demands us to explore the question of how to make the most of good news when it comes, even if it's late. The current president, did the right thing. He exercised ethical leadership. He made a sound gesture. It was bitterly overdue and good news, too. We can hold two truths together at once. We have to. Enslaved people across the American South had been legally freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1892. Slavery became illegal in all of the United States in January of 1865. The Civil War ended in early May of that same year, and yet the news of freedom did not come to this state we sit in right now until June 19th. They were free and didn't know. There can be a bitterness that comes when you ration the truth. We can hold two truths together at once. My body is a Confederate monument and a miraculous machine. Thank God for the one-drop rule. Thank God that every baby my body can make will be Black, and that is a beautiful thing. My body is of halls of presumed and ill-gotten power, and my body is of the Middle Passage. We must hold two truths together at once. Collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land, and here we arrive at epigenetics at last. Please allow me to share a brief statement from Martha Enriquez writing for the BBC. The researchers were investigating a much more obscure type of inheritance, how events in someone's lifetime can change the way their DNA is expressed, and how that change can be passed on to the next generation. This is the process of epigenetics, where the readability or expression of genes is modified without changing the DNA code itself. This afternoon, I'm going to get vulnerable, or more vulnerable, and just wonder right in front of you all. Did that bent double moment in Money, Mississippi write itself on my grandchildren's bodies? The way the Middle Passage and chattel slavery and Jim Crow wrote themselves on mine. Trauma changes the blood. But if I'm honest, it's a part of why I'm so proud of my body and blood. I've got a kind of moral certainty that comes from knowing all I have to do to live in the light is tell the whole truth of who made me and what makes me. My body's story is an act of witnessing. It is two truths together at once and more than two. In another life, or rather when I've got one of my other many hats on, I am a cookbook author. I love food. It is a privilege to feel a certain joy, even luxuriousness and comfort in the notion of farm-to-table, nose-to-tail eating. I co-authored the cookbook come memoir with my mother as a love note to my experience of Black food and Black womanhood, and an offering to the conversation that seeks to restore and expand our food story. Writing poems about food in the same geographical space, serving the same purpose with the same body story, though, is somehow harder. This poem is called A Sustainable Call and Response. What are you asking us to want? What are you expecting our bodies will remember? Here. Let me put it another way. You say farm to, I say field hand. You say fresh produce, I say strange fruit. You say back to the basics, back to the land. I say return unto us our stolen acres. Give us our land back again. How shall we revisit a stolen thing? What harvest invites us home, and our hands' blood still soaked to every now decorative plow, our pastures with a pen stroke turned to someone else's flock? I say no. I say we have left your not yours farms for seats at tables. Our ability to sustain ourselves is our sustenance. Your sustainables come always and too often at our expense. And well, priority is as priority does. So, call me a resource, sugar. Put me on your list of things you hope endure. Collective memory, consensual reality, epigenetics, inherited trauma, the land. We must hold many truths together at once. I said it is my privilege to love food and the land and certain kinds of earthy foodways because for many Southerners, for many Black Americans, this is not such a straightforward thing. In the land of strange fruit, a tree can fast become a gallows. A farm, a prison, a labor camp. We can hold two truths together at once, but it's infinitely easier when we are surrounded by empathetic minds who are working to hold our perspective alongside our own consensual reality. In the spirit of the charge of this lecture series, I'd like to close with a poem I wrote on commission in order to celebrate the renaming of a major thoroughfare in downtown Nashville for one of the greatest, most ethical leaders this country has ever known, John Lewis. This is an American requiem in 2 parts. Part 1, y'all can guess the title. Part 1, it's Good Trouble. Was his body a boat we hoped would take us to shore? Did we count too much on one conscience to do the work? Lord, let his will and effort be enough. Let us find the words to carry on. We have stepped where he stepped and been better for it, wished what he wished and been lifted up, and yet and still, this slow drag, this sad white shuffle towards change. Lord, just think of him fighting to make room for more love. Well, we didn't deserve him. Look at this place. Lord, where our imagination has failed, let us look up and out again. Where our determination has flagged, let us gather us up again. A good man is gone, but his dreams, our dreams, his will, our will, and we, unlike to see his like again, must serve his memory by making good the promise of it. Part 2, chicken scratch. So when I said good, did you know I meant whole? Did you know I meant plans that work, backs that don't break, words with enough weight to get things done? Can you see him, a little boy? Can you see your little boy? You can't see your little boy, can you? Little and boyish and talking to chickens, hoping for a different kind of truth. No, preaching a better kind of truth and hoping for this place to know 2 real things at once and stand them. And Lord, It has come gradually. This freedom, this patience, this bridge breaching thing. Do we call it hope? No. We call it trouble. We call it the lay in the cut behind the thick smoke. We call it the ceaseless breath beneath the knee. We call it what it's always been. We call it what's owed now. We call it what's next, what's next, what's next. Thank y'all so much. Thank you. Shall I sit? Do I stand for questions? I stay for questions. Do we have questions? Oh, great. I'll stay here. Awesome. They're here. There's one here. I think there's a mic for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's not really a question as such as a comment about. I read your piece. You want a Confederate monument. I'm not American. I'm actually from India. And in India, though people don't realize, there is a certain subsection of the Indian population that has faced essentially the same experience as African Americans. It's Indian Muslims actually, unfortunately, and they also need to outgrow. They need to come to terms with many aspects of their own historical experience as African Americans have. Just want to make this comment. And
thank you.
it was a fantastically powerful piece. And the thing was, I'd completely forgotten your name.
Caroline.
A while ago. I know.
Oh.
And it turned up on my Facebook feed yesterday, and it just it was the same piece.
Well, I'm so glad. Thank you for coming. And I think it's, the English sent boats off from that tiny island all over to make lives miserable for brown people and
This wasn't the case. It's probably not politically correct to say so, but it wasn't white colonialism that led to the degradation of Indian Muslims. It was, slightly a lighter than our own people, but not as light as the British. So that colonialism, it was no less destructive for India, from starting around 1080.
Golly.
So, yeah.
Well, I thank you for adding that layer to the conversation. I'm excited to contemplate that further.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the field? There's one here.
Oh, we'll go one more here, and then we'll go to the live stream. So if you have questions on the live stream, please put them in the chat.
So, growing up in the South, you always hear the good old boy sort of comments and everything like that. My question for you is, as a obviously white male, I'm in a lot of rooms with people who just assume, I agree with them on everything. I hesitate to ask only because it's not your job to tell me.
No, it is my job. It's not all black people's job. I have taken that job on.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. So it's good sport. Go forth.
How do you recommend somebody saying, you don't know? You don't know what people have been through because, not you, but people I'm around, you don't know. And how do I defend that? Because I haven't been through it.
So are you asking how you, when you're in rooms with people of color who assume that you think one, or when you're in rooms with other white people who assume that you share their views and you share other ones, or you have other ones?
Yes, correct. So when I'm in rooms with other white people.
Okay, there's two different answers.
Yeah. Sorry. When I'm in rooms with other white people and they, say certain things, and I obviously don't believe those things.
Well, I think that it's a question of, what I will say is I think that we are at a critical juncture where, the civil rights movement is ongoing, right? It didn't stop when Martin Luther King was assassinated. It didn't stop, when the Cosby Show went on TV and black American families looked different, on and on the nighttime tube. We're still in like the deep throes of a really fraught and tenuous undertaking. And so what I would say to you is that you have to figure out, well, okay, number one, in broad strokes, in order to turn, I mean, democracy is not, we can't take it for granted, right? Like, what is it? Was it Benjamin Franklin that said a republic if we can keep it? Right? When they asked what we have after they signed the Constitution, what do we have here? And we said, if we can keep it. I mean, historically, people who study this kind of stuff, my understanding is that republics tend to last like 250 to 300 years for the most part. We're coming up on it. You know, and the wheels are like getting a little wobbly. Like, so I think that when we say, it's not actually alarmist, it's like taking history into good context to say, like, we're in danger here. And so one of the things about like an equitable community living in, making sure we're inclusive moving forward, is that it can't just be like the hippies, Jewish people, good, and like a handful of reasonable white people helping other brown-skinned, like black people in this country get finally free. Like, it needs to be like, just like normal, everyday white people need to like be out in the streets being like, this is outrageous. I need my fellow Americans to have equal access to all of the things that we're supposed to have equal access to. And so figuring out how you do that strategically is a matter of like what you think you're best suited to in the fight. Like, are you a diplomat? Are you a spy? Are you a frontline guy? Are you a tactician? Because it's like, when you're having that conversation, do you quietly note who's saying it and like figure out how to like have a complicated but hard, important conversation with them later? Or do you model, because that's powerful, do you model what it looks like to take a stand in a group? That's also powerful. You have to figure out which one serves you, and that both like in terms of your skills and the audience you're dealing with, right? So, to me, it's, my friends who, I have a lot of, I couldn't hazard a guess. Some large percentage of my friends are white. It's not probably half anymore, but certainly when I was at private school growing up in Nashville, it was more than half. And they all asked me the same question. This is not a hard question for me to answer. And, and I'm like, what you can do? You can go home for Thanksgiving and fight your grandpa. Because he's voting, last I checked, right? It's like people are like, I don't want to disrespect my family member. I'm like, but if your family member is voting for my life to not matter, then you need to fight him. Like, this isn't about manners, it's about morals. So I think that there's, if you have relatives, good friends with objectionable views, like, you put yourself in danger so I don't have to, and you go fight them, because black bodies shouldn't have to be the ones changing objectionable minds. And also, I can't model how to be a good white person to white people. Like, I can model some right-mindedness, but only white people can model how to be good white people to other white people. So, yay, I'm glad that we have more people for the cause. Thank you. No, it's not. No, it's a good question. It's an important question. We're all, we're trying to like save democracy and lives here. It's good. It's not a bad question. And I'm here, I literally just gave a whole talk. I set myself up to answer questions like this. You can't just ask some random person on the street, but you can ask somebody who threw themselves into the conversation for sure. Yeah.
So I teach philosophy sometimes, so maybe it's harder for me than most to hold two thoughts, two truths in my mind. I try to reconcile them and work them out. But with what you just said, I was really struck. I was struck by a lot. I think that was a great talk. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. But you talked about empathy and trying to generate empathy in others, and so one of the things that you had me thinking about is your work and how your work is. Sometimes you're quite kind of out front, you're very argumentative, or
Yeah.
but then you're also drawing on empathy and stories, and so I guess I'm interested in hearing sort of how, this question all comes from this sort of starting place of I love what you're saying. These conversations are so difficult, especially in these polarized times, and to have these kind of complicated talks where you're trying to get people to hold two truths in their mind side by side. You have to negotiate, and sometimes I think maybe you have to speak up, and sometimes you have to tell stories, and so that's just kind of a mess of ideas. But maybe you could say something about them.
Yeah, I think that there's, talks like this are a luxury because you can weave between narrative, sort of straightforward, like incisive, like you need to go get your grandpa or whatever it is. You can have those sort of, that like multiple approach in a talk like this. And also because, again, it's about knowing your audience. I mean, you guys are sitting, on a Thursday afternoon listening to me talk about this stuff. You've elected to come here, so there's space to explore all of the dimensions and procedures for ideas like this. On my car ride here, I had a really lovely gentleman drive me who very happily said, "You don't need to wear a mask," in in Nashville where we technically do, and then proceeded to talk to me about how he felt that when he voted because of morals, and that he thinks that there are certain things that are sacred, like the family structure and things like that, and that he really felt that he said that he didn't claim either of the two major political parties, but wanted to talk to me about how he was a serious lifelong conservative who believed that self-actualization was critical and things like that. And I said, "Thank you so much for being so honest with me with your perspective." I'm glad that you felt like you could share all of that with me, because I knew that my role in that conversation was to let him pick up this like natural-haired, wild-looking black woman and surprise him with being received humanely, because that was the most productive use of my presence in his car. And it's really about the audience. And I love when I don't have to filter, because I am the girl who was like, yeah, I'm just going to be a poet and also write a cookbook and also yell at people on television and also teach young white men at this private school after teaching at the HBCU. Like, I don't, we can hold many truths together at once. But I think that I love my many truths, but I also know that, that's part of why I wear all black. Sometimes there are places to streamline. Do you know? So and I don't always get it right, but I think it's about naming that you're trying to ask people to hold a lot, and then successfully gauging when to scale back, or when to use one approach or another. And I think those are, yeah. I hope that gets somewhere toward answering your question.
Hi, I have a question from the live stream, and then
great.
I also have my own question. So
Yay.
I'll ask the live stream question
Okay.
first. This is from Professor Nicholas DeGenova. Thank you, a really powerful and provocative lecture. I applaud your mobilization of your own body and embodied experience, and your analysis and critique of Confederate monuments is brilliant and deeply moving. However, I'd be inclined to think that your argument is true for every Black American, regardless of complexion or particular ancestry. I was hoping you could explore this proposition.
I love that. I think, my stance, it's a vulnerable one, and it's amazing. When I wrote the piece, I still get mail from it, like a lot of mail. And it's people, and there are Black people, both people who come from a sort of genetically mixed race more like a sort of comparably genetically mixed race background to mine, and people who don't, who find that it lands in a resonant way. And I think that I can try and wade in as far as I can. But I think for me, what I will say is that I took the responsibility of writing it I was inspired by a conversation I'd had with a friend of mine who was German and whose grandparents had been Nazis. And who he was like, and he was healthily ashamed. It's like, I think I think people say shame is not a useful feeling. I think that shame can be productive when it causes people to renounce the objectionable ideologies of their ancestors. And he was talking about how, like the way that you're taught never again, and that you teach it in school to make sure that they don't shame themselves and do something like that again, right? And I think, and I was thinking to myself, like, where the F are all of the like relatives of Confederates who do this? Like the Germans, they renounce their Nazi ancestors. Where are the American Southerners who are related to Confederates who are renouncing their objectionable ancestors? And I was like, well, I'm one, so I'll do it. It came from a place of it wasn't so much about my blackness as about like me wanting to model to white people who were related to objectionable white people, hey, let's model what it looks like to renounce our objectionable ancestors. Of course, like I said, I'm proud of every one of my black ancestors but when I say to remember, to warn, advise, I don't think black American bodies are inherently warnings. And I don't think that black American bodies have an obligation to memorialize the hard truths of the past, the sins of white Americans who thought they owned them. I do think that it is the responsibility of people who are especially, it's hilariously, it's white male privilege that I'm activating here, right? Because it's like the fancy white men I'm related to that are why I waded into this conversation. But it's that part of my privilege, and we can talk about colorism and all sorts of other stuff too. I don't really want to open that door right now because it's like a whole other conversation, because it has afforded me privileges, that light skin, right? But it's also, to me, given me an obligation to use where that came from to turn it on those people that I came from that made my body look like this. So I'm totally, any black person that feels that they too are a Confederate monument and finds that resonant, like I said at the beginning when I wrote Nude Study, like representation is so important, and I so want anyone who sees themselves in it to claim it, but I don't want to put it on by people who don't want it, because I didn't write it to reconcile any part of my blackness. I wrote it because of pieces of my whiteness, my genetic whiteness, if that makes sense. So, I don't know, yeah, that.
It does make sense. I have a question that's from me, and not the live stream. Your talk was incredible. The poetics are incredible. It goes faster than my mind can follow, and so there's so much to think on as I further think on this. But it reminded me, and your original op-ed reminded me of the work that Ida B. Wells did when she said, when she wrote that the justifications for lynching are really about sexual exploitation and sexual economies and sexual politics. And the truth that you landed on that hit me after reading your article and hearing you today is that I felt the same feeling when I read hers, that was a truth, even though of course it's different because she was saying that these are really consensual relationships, and you're saying this is about non-consensual relationships at base. And so of course there's differences, but I want like that landing of the truth that in one hand the justifications for lynching are about sexual exploitation or sexual politics. On the other hand, these the talk about historical remembrance and Confederate monuments, what this is about is sexual exploitation, sexual politics. It landed hard, and then I don't know what to do with that. And thinking about empathy, and I wonder what that truth that's there, that's present, then I wonder what sort of reception that gets, where to go after, where to move to, what spaces to move to afterwards.
I mean, it's so, I love, and I don't know all y'all well enough to be like, it's always all about sex somehow, right? But that's literally why we're alive, or it's how we're alive. It's sort of at the that's what's so complicated. It's the sort of fundamental, it's like our biological, it's not like, it is our biological imperative as human beings. We're animals that are meant to reproduce. And that act of making is attached to that sort of fundamentally. I'm sounding Freudian here, but whatever, I like him. And I'm an English student. I don't have any obligations to the science of it. But I would say more seriously, I think that, so I'm going to talk in circles like I always do and just repeat things, consensual reality, whatever, epigenetics, blah, blah. Lucy Negro was a prostitute. She ran a brothel. I wrote a whole poetry collection about a woman who was a madam and who I needed because she empowered me somehow, right? So there's something about, and people would ask me, don't you think it's demeaning, fraught to have celebrated this woman? And I was like, you tell me what kind of agency, power women could have in that time, in that place that was, more potent than what she had. She was figuring out how to, there was an economy of women's bodies, an economy of brown and black bodies, like, in Europe, in the Americas by then, that meant that everything was a transaction. Even if you were getting married, your parents were selling you. It was some kind of hooking, right? And she was able to choose. She had choices. And I'm not saying that that's okay or not, but I think that we have to make sure that we're framing and acknowledging all of the pieces of the reality when we ask a question like that. And that's not your question. I'm talking about when people ask me about Lucy. And so all of that to say, in the middle section of my book, I have all of these sonnets that use Dark Lady sonnets as springboard lines, and then they're set in the Jim Crow South. And they examine this Ida B. Wells question of where does consent lie? At what point did black women start getting to consent to white men having sex with them, and vice versa, like in all of the different dynamics? When did it become consent? And I think it's complicated. I think about, I've dated people of multiple different colors, but, can consent exist in a power imbalance? Even if you think it's love, right? And there's a lot of, you can't date different, if you're in the, in the armed services, you can't date people of different ranks because consent can't exist in a power imbalance. When you are a white person in America, if you're a white man and a black woman loves you, but the consent burden in, the first half of the 20th century especially is really complicated. Whatever we want love to be or not, especially in the American South, and I still struggle with that. Like, there's a hope that I have that there was some desire that the women that were raped by my great-great-grandmothers who were raped by my great-great-grandfathers, I don't know if I hope. Imagine I'm doing this right in front of you guys. There's a part of me that hopes that there was some desire that those women experienced in those exchanges, that it wasn't all just like some sort of hideous, brutal, totally unsolicited exchange, but even if there was desire, it still was rape. Just like if a 14-year-old wants to sleep with a 20-year-old, it's still rape because there can't be consent. There cannot be consent when the power's not equal. So I don't know. I think that it just makes me think, sex and power are inextricably bound, and what we're really thinking about is how we decentralize power from like white maleness in this country in every direction, and find some imagination of power that really is based on like equitable practices and actual equality across genders and races and all the other identities, which makes me sound a little bit idealistic and happily ever after-y, but girl can dream. We've got, oh. There's another mic here, is it?
Okay. This might be short.
Okay, go for it.
My name's Athena Jackson. I'm the Dean of Libraries
Hi,
here.
so nice to meet you.
Welcome to University of Houston.
Thank you for having me.
I'm a rare book scholar and
Yay.
a logophile myself, and I really appreciate your appreciation for words, and I would love to have a longer conversation about the politics of English defining truth, but that's a whole other.
Well, I'll see you after this.
Yes, we will. We have time to
What are you
talk.
doing this evening?
Yes, we. And I had loved a couple of things you said, and then I have a question. I loved when you said when you were with your students, the all-boys school, and you said hope says wait, and I think that's why I'm here every day at work. And then also something about productive shame dragging itself into the light. And this is in the spirit of that. I want to ask you about your initial lead-in to your talk, which was you can sort of define your impression of a space on its belongingness that it brings to you. And I was curious how the University of Houston made you feel. And I'm not putting you on the spot, because I would prefer productive criticism and authenticity. But if there is some hope in there, I'd like to hear that too.
Oh my gosh. You know, it's funny. I'm only pausing because I'm trying to separate my sense of, I will say that I've been doing, like, I wrote I said what I said in the speech, and it's true, but there is a part of me, like, I can sort of take my shield off and then test what it feels like, but I enter spaces with a sense of surety about how I'm going to feel in them regardless of how they manifest, if that makes sense. Like, I sort of, like, before I come anywhere, I'm like, I've decided that I'm going to enjoy this and be fine and belong. Because I spent a huge chunk of my life, part of where these lessons come from is I spent a huge chunk of my life just being in all white space and just fitting in. You know, like, I went to prep school in New Hampshire, I went to Harvard, I went to private school in Nashville with, there were 6 black kids in my whole grade. I'm totally, so what I would say is that a place like this, where everyone's like sort of academic and lovely, it is a little bit difficult for me to know what of my ease of, I'm having a great time is the short answer. And I feel very welcome. I don't know how much of that is just that this kind of environment is very easy for me and how I grew up, and how much of that is some, unusual inclusivity made manifest. I will say it's by far, it's one of the most diverse campuses I have ever witnessed. It's certainly in the South. I've never seen anything like that here. Harvard was very white, so there's that. But I've enjoyed that a lot. It's sort of surreal. It's also surreal because COVID. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like I'm a little overwhelmed just to see so many people anyway, because it's been so long. But I mean, the school's doing great. Y'all came and let me talk in a room full of mostly not black people about how wild this stuff is for an hour, and have sat and asked questions. I think that it's lovely. I don't know. Over here and then, sorry.
I want to comment about the taxi driver and the erstwhile grandpa. I think you did the right thing in the way you responded to the taxi driver, though I think you could have pushed just a little more. But I think you're dead wrong about how people should go fight their grandfathers.
Okay.
Because everyone has different set of moral constituents in them and historical constituents in them, and sometimes if you fight them, all you do is have them add another brick to that wall. I think the correct or more effective way to do that is to find Grandpa's moral compass, wherein it's proper and right to change or begin to get him or her to change their perspective in this way. And I think this tendency to fight is one of the things that's really wrong with America right now. That it keeps people from being willing to listen and to change.
Well, I should say I'm glad that you said that, because I completely, when I say fight, part of the war is won at the diplomatic ball, and part of it is one in hand-to-hand combat. I think there are many different ways to advance the fight, and being politely asking Grandpa what he thinks of this book if he'll read it, and like having a chat is still to me the fight. But I should probably frame it less combatively in order to make it make more sense. But I absolutely, when I say fight Grandpa, I mean don't skip Thanksgiving dinner. Go figure out how to sit, because I have so many friends who are like, I'm not even going home. Like my family has these objectionable views. I'm like, no, go home and have complicated conversations. Because what it is they don't want to have a tense conversation, so they won't go home because they know what they believe and they know what their family believes. And I'm like, I think you should go home and wade in, because like you have love on your side. You have things to activate that can actually help bring them round. You know them better. Like so to me, it's, when I say fight, what I mean is stay in the big picture fight, but that doesn't mean argue and disrespect your grandfather in a way that makes him belligerent or buckle down and settle into his stance more fervently. It's about being willing to stay in the heated, or stay with the tension and see what you can do to like open the mind.
We're in complete
Yeah.
agreement.
But thank you for asking the question, because I think you're right. I don't want it to sound like I'm saying combat people, because that's not always a good strategy in the first place. Thank you, guys. Thank you for staying. This is so fun. What a great conversation. Thank you, guys. How fun.